At the end of World War II, the victors found gigantic unfinished systems of tunnels all over Nazi Germany. Hitler ordered the construction of some 800 underground complexes in an effort to keep the Nazi war machine alive. 60 years ago, British and American bomber squadrons tried to destroy these subterranean shelters, including Hitler's very own Alpine bunker. These are the catacombs at Obersalzberg. Areas of the tunnel system still remain unexplored. Many of the intricate underground installations look as if the war here ended only yesterday. To the arriving Allies, they were a curiosity. But to the Nazis, they were the last hope for a dying empire. The Eulengebirge, or Owl Mountains, a region in former Lower Silesia. Here, in the mountain ridges close to the Polish town of Glusza, is hidden one of the most curious legacies of the Third Reich. Polish and German amateur historians have made it their business to explore the peculiar subterranean facilities. Somewhere in the forest of the so-called Boozer's Heights, a mysterious chasm drops 48 meters into the earth. The experts believe it to be an unfinished elevator shaft. Jürgen Müller of the association Berlin's Underworlds has been coming to this place for many years in order to find new evidence. Not least, the gigantic timber-lined hall proves that the Nazis were planning great things here.
In
total, there are 7 underground tunnel systems. Only a very small part of them, maybe 1/8, was concreted. The rest are tunnels that are only partly supported with timber trunks and beams. Around 40,000 people were used as forced laborers in this entire area in the Eulengebirge. The temperature in the tunnels was about 8 degrees, and the laborers worked shifts of 10 or 12 hours a day. One can imagine that all this, along with a poor diet, caused many people to die.
Dann können Sie sich vorstellen, dass bei schlechter Ernährung, dass es da sehr viele Tote gab.
Concrete bunkers for the guards and battlements for machine guns demonstrate the importance of the installation. Under strictest secrecy, a new headquarters for the Führer was being built here from November 1943, codename Reich. Apparently, Hitler considered the Wolfschanze, his main field headquarters in East Prussia, no longer safe enough. For the building of a bomb-proof underground town for 20,000 people in the Eulengebirge, Armament Minister Speer granted 130 million Reichsmarks. An area of 40,000 square meters was to be ready for occupancy in August 1945. Many of the slave laborers used for the building of Reich were detailed from the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. In early 1945, the camp had some 75,000 inmates, while about 13,000, mostly Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz, were put up in outcamps in the Eulengebirge. Half of them did not survive the labor for the safety of the dictator. The slave laborers had dug 3 kilometers of tunnels into the Wolfsberg, the largest complex among the systems planned in the Eulengebirge. Today, parts of the intricate tunnel system are underwater, According to statements made by the site managers, 55% of the planning stage was completed by November 1944. Excavations were to commence immediately. Exact assessments about the intended extent of the subterranean bunkers are not easy to make, as the original building plans for the Riesa project disappeared after the end of the war. According to the few remaining documents of the Nazis, plans also included the production of so-called Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, in a gigantic subterranean factory. However, 60 years later, it's difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction. Jacek Duszak is convinced that there are still many undiscovered underground installations in the Eulengebirge.
We have information that all prisoners were evacuated at the end of the war, except for some who were ordered to camouflage the installations. Apparently, they disappeared without a trace, and so did their supervisors. Of course, this is all unconfirmed information. The Nazis had plenty of time to camouflage the tunnels. It is very difficult today to find the sealed portals because they were filled in skillfully. Now trees grow on the soil. They covered their tracks really well.
But isolated, well-hidden locations were not the only places the Nazis chose. The party elite also required space and the splendor that befitted only the highest ranks. This is Fürstenstein Castle near Waldenburg, once the residence of the Princes of Pless. In 1940, the spacious property of Churchill's relatives was sequestered. 4 years later, some extensive renovation work began. Officially, the plan was to convert the Baroque jewel into a house for guests of the Nazi government. In reality, the castle was for Adolf Hitler and his minions. 35 architects from Speer's staff worked under strictest secrecy on a subterranean shelter system with direct access to the castle. In case of an emergency, an elevator would take the Führer from his chambers 50 meters deep into the mountain. The dictator and his closest entourage were supposed to have 3,200 square meters of floor space.
The basic idea, among other things, was that this was to become Hitler's last headquarters. Also, each of the leading personalities of the Third Reich would have their own subterranean shelter system. For example, there would be one for Goebbels, one for Himmler, and so on. Of course, the supreme commanders of the Wehrmacht, with Keitel and Jodl, would move in there too. For that reason, precise blueprints existed as to who was getting how many cubic meters.
Newsreel footage from the Wolfschanze near Rastenburg in the summer of 1944 as Hitler said farewell to Benito Mussolini. The Führer's headquarters in East Prussia lay on an area of 250 hectares and was protected by 3 heavily guarded no-go zones. The railway tracks which the allies of the Third Reich used when visiting the headquarters are now overgrown. The former Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, is a field of rubble. Before they withdrew, the Germans blew up all the buildings, and the Red Army did the rest. Hitler's private shelter is a bulky lump. In 1944, all important structures in the innermost no-go zone were vaulted by massive reinforced concrete domes. Rokus Misch has not been to Rastenburg since the end of 1944. He was a member of the Führer's escort commando, so he was almost always at Hitler's side in the Wolfschanze. Returning here after 60 years is completely different from how he'd imagined it. It is difficult now for him to recognize anything in the ruins.
It's a massive construction. Before, the residential shelters were 2, maybe 3 meters high at the most, and now it's so enormous. I'm amazed at what has become of it. I can still remember very clearly how everything used to look here, and all that had happened so fast. It's incredible.
Das ist in einem Rückzugsverfahren passiert. Unglaublich, aber wahr. Wie schnell die das gemacht haben. In ein paar Wochen hat
Within a few weeks, the whole grounds here had changed. Just in a few weeks. Before, there were just some flat huts. If you came through there was a big room to the right with a long table where the briefings took place. It was quite cramped. It was not large. The massive structures were built afterwards.
Eingeengt, das war nicht groß. Das Gewaltige ist nahe entstanden.
When Hitler came from Berchtesgaden with his retinue to his new headquarters in East Prussia in mid-July 1944, his private bunker was not yet finished, so the dictator stayed at the visitors' shelter. Temporarily, the briefings took place in a nearby wooden cabin, and this was the case at noon on July the 20th, 1944. Hitler had asked his generals to present their reports. Servants and other authorized personnel were also in the room, including a Colonel von Stauffenberg. Around 16 minutes to 1, the commander-in-chief bent over a big map table, exactly here. At that moment, a bomb exploded. Stauffenberg had placed it under the table just minutes before. The explosion killed 4 and seriously injured 7 others. The cabin was almost completely destroyed. Hitler, however, protected by the heavy map table, suffered only minor injuries. A planned coup in Berlin failed on the same night. Still, the security measures after the assassination attempt were not tightened significantly.
He was never visibly scared. We never noticed that he was afraid in any way. When someone called his attention to it for whatever reason, he would always say, "I'll be fine, nothing will happen to me." Also, there weren't any changes as such, nothing at all. Everything was just as it was, as in the days before the attempt. The 20th of July happened, and in the following days, everything went on as usual. There was a reception for Mussolini, and then there were some other receptions, as if nothing had happened at all.
Only Hitler's closest aides knew that construction of a gigantic subterranean headquarters in Lower Silesia was in progress. Hitler hoped that Riesa would be ready soon. In there, he would be safe from enemy paratroopers and Allied bomber squadrons. During that period, Hitler spent very little time in Berlin. The Reich's capital was under attack by British and American bombers on an almost daily basis. In spite of the looming defeat, most Germans in 1944 still believed in and trusted their Führer. In order to boost the endurance of the population, air raid shelters had been constructed in all the major cities of Nazi Germany. What was probably the largest shelter has remained almost intact in Dortmund. The entrances are camouflaged to avoid the uninvited.
Here we have a typical characteristic feature of air raid shelters. These gas locks are always equipped with a door buffer. One could create an overpressure in the installation, so if there was a gas attack outside, one could prevent the gas from penetrating into the shelters.
After the first major Allied attacks on Dortmund, the public air raid shelters proved insufficient and offered only inadequate protection. As a result, excavations began for a gigantic tunnel system under the city. 80,000 people would have been able to get out of danger from the bombs in shelters up to 16 meters under the surface of the Earth. 5 kilometers of the tunnel system were finished.
We're now coming into the area underneath Körnerplatz. Here we have a beautiful plan from 1943. You can see how the shelters would have looked if the planned work had been finished. This room here would have 2 stories then, lined with wood in order to keep out the humidity and make it a little bit warmer. It would all be divided up with corridors and individual cabins with fresh air and exhaust ducts, but obviously it never got to this stage. The end of the war caught up with the construction work. Now, let's move on.
The authorities maintain the galleries, but as yet have not approved any public use for them. Since 1945, they have remained dark and empty.
Ein Querschnitt durch den Berliner Sonntag im 5. Kriegssommer.
Newsreel footage from Berlin. The Nazi propaganda tried to persuade the people that there was some kind of normality in their everyday life. Yet the truth could not be withheld completely.
Die Uniform beherrscht das Straßenbild. In dem durch Terrorangriffe mehrfach schwer heimgesuchten Berliner Zoo, der vor genau 100 Jahren eröffnet wurde. Freibad Wannsee hat von der alten Anziehungskraft nichts eingebüßt.
The idyllic atmosphere from the capital was a sham. People were rarely safe. Allied bombs fell on Berlin almost daily. A subterranean air raid shelter testifies to the real fears of the community. Almost every night, residents and commuters gathered here, as the installation had been integrated into a subway station. When the sirens wailed, people often had just a few minutes to reach the bomb-proof chambers. On February the 3rd, 1945, 1,000 American bombers launched an all-out bombing raid on the Reich's capital. The first bomb struck the city center at 2 minutes past 11.
It suddenly became very, very quiet. One felt that something had hit the shelter, not because it was so loud, but because the noise was more like a thud. It was a very ominous moment and very frightening because one didn't really know whether the shelter would hold out. The bombs struck downstairs, where we would usually be, down at the entrances. Afterwards, we saw many dead bodies lying down there. It was only by chance that we were on the 3rd floor on that day, and so we survived the bombing.
Entire districts were in flames. The smoke turned day into night. A firestorm raged for hours. Many thousands died during this air raid on Berlin, the heaviest of the war. Hundreds of thousands became homeless. Little was left from the former Berlin of the Third Reich. Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, was supposed to realize the Führer's sinister visions. But construction had long been suspended, and the few structures that had been completed were converted to accommodate the war effort. Somewhere in Berlin's zoo, the Tiergarten, can still be found the meticulously concealed entrance to a street tunnel of Hitler's world capital, Germania. Nobody has descended for years. Dietmar Arnold from the association Berlin's Underworlds ventures in. It can be a risky undertaking, as poisonous gases sometimes form underground.
We're now almost 9 meters under the Tiergarten in the western tunnel of the main junction. It was planned to be an expressway or motorway tunnel, 90 meters long, 14 meters wide, 4.8 meters high. These are remains of Germania. The junction was to be the intersection of the planned east-west and north-south connections. Large parts of the east-west connection were indeed built, which today are the Straße des 17. Juni and Unter den Linden. But the north-south connection was never built. This is what remains of those ambitious plans.
Cars have never driven through this tunnel. At some point during the war, a partition wall must have been built. Armament plants would have continued their production here in a bomb-proof environment. The only reminder of its former use is a rusty lamp. At the far end of the tunnel, Dietmar Arnold has found evidence that the tunnel was also used by Berlin's population as an air raid shelter during the bomb attacks.
This is the access stairway through which people would come down. I think it's really interesting how worn down these stairs are. There must have been masses of people who used these narrow steps to enter this tunnel. And this here may have been an emergency door to the shelter.
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels was concerned that the unrelenting airstrikes could shake morale on the home front. His staff secretly filmed these scenes from Berlin on his behalf. The population never got to see such footage. By that time, the Nazi leadership appeared only rarely in public. Goebbels visited the ruins of St. Hedwig's Cathedral, demonstrating his determination for the newsreel. The minister had a private bunker under his official villa in the center of the government district. The rest of the installations were discovered accidentally during some construction work in 1998. Little is known about the interior furnishings of the shelters. Goebbels' diaries indicate that he and his family used the shelter often. By all accounts, the chambers were not luxuriously furnished, but they were well equipped. The propaganda minister was able to maintain constant contact with the outside world by means of a modern telephone exchange. Despite many conservationist protests, the rest of the underground installations were filled in soon after their discovery. A private film of the Goebbels family from 1943 shows how things may have looked in the bunker.
Aufstehen! Aufstehen! Helgachen, komm her. Schnell ran. Holly, steh schon auf.
From the outset, Magda Goebbels was one of Hitler's most ardent supporters. When the downfall of the Nazi Empire became inevitable, she didn't hesitate. It's believed Magda herself poisoned all 6 children before she and Josef took their own lives in the Führer's bunker. At the end of April 1945, Adolf Hitler barricaded himself in the bunker under the Chancellery in Berlin and waited for a miracle. Rochus Misch accompanied his Führer through this final chapter.
Hitler's death dragged on from the 22nd to the 30th of April. It was postponed from one day to the next. Actually, Hitler wanted to put an end to it on the 22nd, after he had dismissed everyone. I will stay here, he said. I'm not leaving Berlin. But everyone else should go and leave him behind. He was ready to take his own life. But then the radio operator picked up a communication of the Western Allies that said the Germans absolutely must continue to defend Berlin for another 2 or 3 weeks. When Hitler was informed, he said they should have thought of it earlier. The war is lost now.
Das hat man Hitler mitgeteilt und da hat Hitler gesagt, das hätte sich früher überlegen sollen, der Krieg ist doch verloren.
On the afternoon of April the 30th, the dictator and his newly wedded wife, Eva Braun, retired to their underground chambers to commit suicide.
Es war Kirchenstille, Mäuschenstille.
It was as silent as a church. You couldn't hear a sound. Everyone was whispering. Then someone shouted, "Linge, Linge." Linge was Hitler's manservant. "I think it's done." Then the door opened and I looked in, of course. Then the next person went in and another door was opened, and then I saw Hitler slumped by the couch. Or maybe he had collapsed on the armchair next to it. I'm not 100% certain anymore. I also saw Eva lying there with her knees tucked up.
Und ich sehe die Eva da liegen mit ganz angezogenen Knien.
On the following day, the Red Army stormed into the center of Berlin. Now, only pockets of Nazi youth resisted the Soviet onslaught. A house-to-house battle for Berlin finally came to a close. The victors of Berlin inspected the ruins of Hitler's center of power.
At Merkers, Germany, this salt mine holds one of the strangest secrets of the war. A secret that was to deal Germany a crushing financial blow during the last days of the conflict. Here, GIs uncovered a fabulous hoard of jewelry, silver, currency, bullion, and art treasures. Much of it the accumulated loot of 5 years of war. Practically every museum in Europe is represented in these masterpieces, which include Raphael's, Rembrandt's, Van Dyck's, and many other great masters' works, buried now 1,200 feet below the ground in what the Nazis considered a safe hiding place and a bomb-proof shelter.
The tunnels of the former potassium mines in Kaiserode crisscross large areas of southern Thuringen. Over the course of decades, miners have dug hundreds of kilometers on several levels through the saline soil. The complex system of tunnels resembles a maze. If something was to be hidden here, chances are it would not be found. After the demise of the German Democratic Republic of East Germany, hardly any salt has been mined around the village of Merkers. The mine owners are hoping for greater profits from tourism. The history of the incredible discovery of the treasure in 1945 is supposed to fire the visitor's imagination. Maybe something could still be hidden here. The story of the spectacular deposits has been accurately reconstructed.
In February and March 1945, this stretch of tunnel we are covering now was used as storage for the gold and monetary reserves of Nazi Germany. After the devastating air raid on Berlin, according to the records, Walter Funk, the president of the Reichsbank at the time, decided to move the gold reserves to a safe place. The location they chose was the mine Kaiserode 23, the modern-day Merkers. By the beginning of March, the reserves had been transported by freight trains and stored here. Most of the workers in the mine were foreign displaced persons. Only the security personnel and the overseers were German. It must have been common knowledge among the foreign workers and prisoners of war who worked in the mine that the gold of the Nazis was stored here. For this reason, when the Americans took Merkers on April the 4th, it didn't take long before they tracked down the treasure and came into this chamber we're in now.
American financial and art experts immediately began to examine the treasure. The hoard constituted the gold and monetary reserves of the Third Reich, as well as the art collections of Berlin's museums. Few stolen cultural assets were found here. At a later point, however, the Allies discovered many of the art treasures the Nazis had looted in other mines. Intriguingly, some valuable items are still missing today. Little by little, the Allied armies occupied all of Nazi Germany. On April the 22nd, 1945, American and French army units took Stuttgart. The remaining German troops did not defend the city and capitulated to the Allied forces. A bunker that testifies to the final combat for Stuttgart has been preserved, deep inside the Killersberg. It appears that the Wehrmacht commanders in Stuttgart coordinated their pointless mission from this underground complex. Telephone and radio operators relayed messages that never reached the soldiers above. The rooms seem untouched, as if the war ended only yesterday. The safe appears to have been opened by force. The remains of a gas mask lie on the floor. The door to the security office is riddled with bullet holes, indicating an exchange of fire. Did the soldiers within put up a last stand? Perhaps more lives were sacrificed for the Führer, even though the war was now lost. For a long time, the Allies were concerned that Hitler, together with his last loyal supporters, would barricade himself at Obersalzberg, where the Nazi leadership had kept a hermetically sealed safe haven since the 1930s. During the war, the Führer and his retinue had often come to Berchtesgaden, and whenever Hitler stayed up here, he was always heavily guarded by his personal security and SS troopers. Descent into the underworld of the mountain. A team of surveyors will systematically explore and measure the subterranean shelters. Directly from the Obersalzberg Records Office, a shaft leads 30 meters straight down into the earth. Nobody knows exactly what is hidden down here. The wooden staircase collapsed decades ago. The surveyor team are cautiously lowered with the help of a motorized rope elevator. At the bottom of the shaft, the team expect to find the entrance to a half-finished SS shelter. They find 350 meters of largely unsupported tunnels. Only the first caverns have been lined with bricks and the cable shafts concreted. The advance ends 60 meters deep into the rock. Florian Bayerl is one of the most knowledgeable experts as far as Obersalzberg is concerned. He has been investigating its history since his youth and has interviewed many witnesses of the time. Bayerl has established that the system of tunnels and bunkers is almost 6 kilometers long. Apparently, even bigger installations were planned. Here people worked 3 shifts a day until just before the end of the war.
This is actually the last unexplored and unregistered section of the Obersalzberg bunkers. It's an SS shelter that was laid out at an enormous depth, far under the existing tunnels. Due to this long shaft, which was built under here, it was not accessible. But now digital surveying technology has enabled us for the first time to form a precise and complete picture of all the subterranean installations under the Obersalzberg. When you study the records of the Obersalzberg Council regarding the tunnel structures and fuse them with the testimonies of witnesses of that time, you come to the conclusion that this whole tunneled area was intended to be protection shelters for approximately 400 SS troopers. At the same time, however, these gigantic halls that we discovered here today were designed to be large ammunition depots for the defense of what we presume was an Alpine fortress.
Bayerl's readings show that the shelter structures of Hitler's Berghof begin no more than 10 meters away. Was the SS also supposed to be deployed underground for the Führer's defense?
A total of 3,000 laborers worked in the tunnels of Obersalzberg. When you look at this section here, you can see different stages of development, from the unlined crumbly rock that is still predominant here to the semi-finished final stage of construction, as we can see around us here, with the drain tiles. With the same workforce numbers, one would certainly need to work another 4 to 5 months in order to finish this tunnel system and be able to use it as an air raid shelter.
It was Hitler's notorious secretary, Martin Bormann, who directed the construction of the subterranean air raid shelters at Obersalzberg. Bormann had a spacious bunker constructed for his large family too. Today it may be entered only with a special permit. 77 steps led directly from Bormann's house down into the underworld. An almost 60-meter-long corridor led into the private chambers. Sheltered machine gun posts were built in for protection against enemy intruders.
The entire Obersalzberg shelter complex was completely autonomous as far as supplies were concerned. An independent water supply was available, there was a poison gas-proof ventilating system, and a store of food supplies. It would have been possible to hold out here for a long period of time. The only problem would have been that they could not guard the entrances from the outside, but only from within. There were no fortifications on the outside, which means that the enemy, during a siege, could penetrate into the shelters up to the machine gun posts and would have to be fought off from there. This is the section of the Bormanns. 3 different chambers, all ventilated with bunk beds, probably for the children. The thing is that one consciously used a relatively warm paint color here in order to make the surroundings a little jollier.
Hier bewusst eine relativ warme Farbe verwendet worden ist, dieses Dasein unter Tage nicht ganz so öde zu gestalten.
The light switches for the children were also positioned about 50 centimeters lower than elsewhere.
Ist man 50 Zentimeter fast tiefer gegangen wie sonst wo. Es gab
The floors were wooden. You can imagine the bunk beds standing here. As you can see, they even had pictures hanging on the walls. The nails are still there. The Bormanns stayed here in this shelter for weeks, not only here underground, but in the house too, of course. The danger from enemy bombers was quite extreme at the end of 1943, so the Bormanns had made themselves a home here.
Und die Familie Bormann hat sich also richtig eingerichtet hier unten.
As well as living quarters, the bunker had a communications control room, able to receive and send messages to the fronts. But Bormann also had a small underground town laid out for Hitler and Eva Braun. The entire entourage of the dictator would have been able to get out of danger from the Allied bomb attacks under the Berghof. At the beginning of April 1945, supplies were unloaded and stored in the shelters. Even Allied intelligence assumed the dictator was already at Obersalzberg.
The false security of Berchtesgaden, from where so much of the world's tragedy was planned and directed, was shattered in April by a force of Allied heavy bombers. Arriving at daybreak, they attacked Hitler's notorious mountain hideout and the chalet in the valley below with 12,000-pound bombs fused for deep penetration. The SS barracks nearby also received accurate attention.
The SS barracks and Hitler's personal chalet were both hit numerous times during the attack. But safely stored below ground were yet more spoils of Hitler's crumbling empire. The heavy air raid on Obersalzberg rendered the Berghof uninhabitable. The bombs destroyed most of the buildings, but the sorry remains of Hitler's royal retinue survived in the bunkers below. Then came the Americans. US Commander General Omar Bradley went to visit Obersalzberg. The demolished Berghof became a sightseeing attraction for the victors. The mysterious bunkers also aroused the interest of the US soldiers. A camera crew of the US Army captures a GI entering the Führer's bunker with curiosity. In the 1,800 square meters of shelters, Hitler and his last followers could have held out for weeks.
Up until the last day, the people at Obersalzberg expected that Hitler would come. Everything was prepared, the shelters were all furnished and ready as far as possible, and the vanguard from the Chancellery of the Reich in Berlin was already there. Therefore, one can say that if Hitler had come here, the war might have lasted a bit longer. From here, he would have been able, at least logistically, to control and direct whatever was left of his Reich at that time.
Den Trümmerhaufen, der noch übrig war zu dem Zeitpunkt, weiter zu lenken und leiten.
When the radio reported Hitler's death on May 1st, 1945, the security staff at Obersalzberg began to loot the remaining possessions of their Führer. With the permission of the Americans, Berchtesgaden's citizens later also helped themselves to the hoarded supplies. Hitler's private archives had been set on fire by one of his adjutants before the Americans found them. The library that was still in the bunker, as well as his music collection and paintings, were confiscated by the Americans. It appears that unauthorized persons gained access to Eva Braun's bedroom after the end of the war. The quarters had been completed and were ready for occupancy by April 1945. Eva Braun's extensive wardrobe and her china were already waiting. Upon the express wishes of the Führer's lover, a bathroom with a tub had been installed especially for her private use. Today there is very little left to see. The chambers stand empty, and yet illicit treasure hunters often break in and search through the confusing maze of tunnels and rooms. The Führer's quarters were right next to Eva Braun's. Apparently the furnishings were Spartan. The Americans cleared away the few furniture and fittings, and the rest fell into the hands of tourists and souvenir hunters. Even the tiles were stripped from the bathroom. Hitler had visited the bunker only once and would not return to Obersalzberg. He would meet his end in Berlin,